In this lecture, I plan to conclude the political breakup and partition of Alexander's empire. At this point, we are essentially moving into a new generation of political figures. Most of the individuals actually represent a generation after Alexander, whereas in the previous two lectures, we were dealing with individuals who either were members of Philip's generation, Antipater, Antigonus the One-Eyed, or men who had served Alexander, in some instances had been his friends. Certainly all of them had owed their positions and success to Alexander. And there were the exceptions of Cassander and Demetrius, who were just a bit too young to serve in the Macedonian army. But in this lecture, we now pass into essentially the second generation of rulers. Rulers who would not have had a direct tie with Alexander, and to whom Alexander represented a predecessor, a god. Essentially, they ruled as Alexander's heirs through the achievements of their fathers. Well, the Battle of Ipsus had determined that the empire of Alexander the Great would be partitioned. Antigonus the One-Eyed was slain on the battlefield, and his son Demetrius eventually made his way to the coast. He still had a sizable fleet. He controlled the island of Cyprus, the Phoenician ports, scattered ports across the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean, and he had large mercenary forces and still apparently a sizable treasury. He was, however, a king without a kingdom in any meaningful sense, and he was in desperate need of a kingdom if he were not to end his days as essentially nothing more than a soldier of fortune. The victors at Ipsus divided the empire. All of them now held the title king. There was no danger of any member of the old family of Alexander the Great challenging any one of the four. The Argead family was gone. The last members had been murdered or killed some 5 or 6 years earlier. It is best to review who the victors were and what they planned to do, and how at least Seleucus and Cassander and Ptolemy essentially established future successful kingdoms, whereas Lysimachus, the man who was so important in the victory at Ipsus, in the end really didn't establish a long-lived kingdom. Essentially, the kingdom died with him. Well, first, Seleucus got, in some ways, the lion's share. The Asian possessions fell to his control. Most of Asia Minor, essentially the Great Plateau of Phrygia and Cappadocia, the various regions of southeastern Asia Minor, Cilicia with fertile lands and Greek-style cities, and then a huge area across the Levant, Babylonia, to the Iranian provinces, essentially to the Hindu Kush. That Asian empire now fell to Seleucus. He also succeeded to the city that Antigonus was building, and he finished that capital city and named it Antiochia, or Antioch, as we say in English. And this is named after his son, Antiochus I, who completed his father's project of building this great capital city in Syria. It is now Antakya in Turkey. It's actually the Turkish portion of Syria in a way. And Antioch was destined to be one of the great courts of the Hellenistic world. It would be the principal court of Seleucus and his heirs, who are known as the Seleucid kings, who ruled over the Asian possessions of Alexander. The general Lysimachus, the king Lysimachus, he gained the western half of Asia Minor, including the numerous Greek cities of Ionia and the Hellespontine regions. He controlled Thrace, which was the vital recruiting ground. He had control of both the Bosporus and the Hellespont, and essentially the whole grain route that went from the Black Sea into the Greek world and fed the various cities of the Aegean world. Lysimachus built his own capitals. He refounded the city of Sestos, which is on the European side of the Hellespont crossing, and established a city called, obviously enough, Lysimaca, named after him. He also is the man responsible for the construction of Ephesus as we see it today, a site that many tourists have visited. He relocated Ephesus to the position where most of the Roman age monuments are located. That is between two hills away from an earlier site. and developed the great port and harbor, so that by Lysimachus's death in 281 BC, Ephesus for the first time emerges as the principal port of Asia Minor. It displaces Miletus and the port on the island of Samos, and Ephesus becomes what the Romans call it, the first city of Asia, he prote tes Asias. And the Hellenistic city of Ephesus is largely a tribute to Lysimachus, who intended to keep it as one of his capitals. Cassander ruled in Macedon as king. He established a number of important dynastic cities. The most important in northern Greece was the town Thermae, refounded as Thessalonica, named after his wife, the half-sister of Alexander. That is today Saloniki, the great city of northern Greece. Of course, Ptolemy had Alexandria. The city was under construction, and probably Alexandria in its first phase was not completed until Ptolemy II, the son of Ptolemy, came to the throne. So Cassander ruled in Macedon with the control over the Greek cities. Ptolemy had control of Egypt, and he took as his share of the spoils at Ipsus the cities of the Levantine shore. He eventually drove Demetrius's forces out of Tyre and Sidon. He eventually occupied Cyprus, and he occupied a region which the Greeks would call Kole Syria, that is southern Syria, the region around Damascus today. And these were all areas that technically were to be awarded to Seleucus. Seleucus, who remembered Ptolemy's help back in 312 BC, never contested Ptolemy's control of these cities. And they remained in Ptolemaic hands until Ptolemy died in 283 BC, but Seleucus never relinquished his claim to these cities, and the heirs of Ptolemy and Seleucus would fight 6 so-called Syrian wars over control of essentially southern Syria and the Phoenician ports. And that would only end in 200 BC when the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies and took the area, took the cities. So you now had essentially 4 successor kingdoms, 3 of which were destined to endure as territorial kingdoms in the Hellenistic world. There was also Demetrius, who was essentially a wild card. And Demetrius was a potentially unstable element in this new concert of Hellenistic powers, of Macedonian kingdoms, if you will. As I noted earlier, he was desperately in need of a kingdom. He still had a fleet, and he had a sizable army and treasury. And actually, Seleucus saw Demetrius as a potential ally. By 300 BC, Seleucus knew that the long-term prospects of friendship between himself and Ptolemy were not good. He resisted war with Ptolemy out of an old sense of obligation and friendship. Furthermore, to the west, Lysimachus controlled Western Asia Minor. This was a natural extension to Seleucus's kingdom. And Seleucus, just like Ptolemy, needed access to the Aegean world in Macedon, and that meant Lysimachus and Cassander win the way. Both the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms, as we'll discuss in the coming lectures, very much depended on access to the manpower and the resources of the Aegean world, that is, the Greek world. And these Macedonian kings essentially were, in their personnel and their culture, Greek. They drew on Greek personnel to run these empires, which were essentially spear-won territory, whether it be Egypt or the Asian possessions. So in 300 BC, it was clear to both Ptolemy and to Seleucus that the political order in the Aegean world was not quite as favorable as they would like. Therefore, in 300 BC, there was some kind of rapprochement. Demetrius actually gave one of his daughters, Stratonice is her name, in marriage to Seleucus, who divorced his Iranian wife. This marriage didn't last long. Stratonice was very, very young, maybe 18 years of age, and it became quite evident to the father that his son Antiochus pined away for his new stepmother, and Seleucus actually divorced Stratonice and gave her in marriage to his son Antiochus. There's a very strange story told in the sources about this, but in any event, the new couple, Antiochus and Stratonice, retired to Babylon and ruled the upper satrapies for the balance of Seleucus's reign down to 281 BC. However, that marital link was important. It linked the future Antigonid kings of Macedon thereafter with the Seleucid kings of Asia. Demetrius got his opportunity in 297 BC. The position of Cassander was always very personal in Macedon. He ruled with a strong hand. And when he died in 297 BC, apparently of some type of wasting disease that may or may not have been tuberculosis, we have a description, and of course everyone who fancies himself as a history of medicine comes up with his diagnosis of what Cassander died of. Cassander died of this wasting disease, and so did one of his sons, his oldest son, one of three, who was named Philip. That left two young sons, Antipater, named after, of course, the former regent, and Alexander. They were the sons of Cassander and Thessalonike, the half-sister of Alexander, and therefore had a tenuous claim to the Argead royal family. Both brothers detested each other, as young brothers would. They were both adolescents. Mom always favored the younger brother. And the result was the two sons went at it in a civil war. The brothers foolishly summoned allies. The middle brother, Antipater, summoned a fellow from Epirus, the old homeland of Olympias, and he summoned a fellow named Pyrrhus, the Red King of Epirus, first cousin of Alexander the Great and one of many of Alexander's imitators, just like Demetrius, and we'll be getting back to Pyrrhus. This is the man who wins the original Pyrrhic victory. And Pyrrhus intervened on the side of Antipater, and Alexander, at the egging of his mother, Thessalonica, approached Demetrius. Demetrius was only too happy to oblige. He arrived in Athens with an enormous fleet. The Athenians rose in celebration, threw out the Macedonian garrison, and Demetrius, in a great show, restored the Athenian democracy, which hadn't been operating since 322 BC, when it had been abolished by Antipater. He, meanwhile, swiftly won over the Greeks and moved into Thessaly, gaining a great deal of support. Alexander, on the other hand, won the civil war, and his older brother had murdered Mom by poisoning her. That was not good, and he lost his support in Macedon, and he was chased out, eventually captured and executed by Lysimachus. And so this young prince, Alexander V, was left in charge of Macedon, and he happily went into Thessaly to inform Demetrius that his services were no longer needed. Demetrius held a magnificent dinner for his ally, listened very carefully to Alexander V, and then immediately had him arrested and executed, and Demetrius head on to Pella and essentially declared himself king. Demetrius actually had a great deal of support. He was, after all, the son of Antigonus, married to Phila. Phila was the daughter of Antipater. He united the two powerful families of Antipater and Antigonus, two of the senior families that went back to Philip II. He had no relationship to the Argead throne. That is, he did not have any descent to the family of Alexander the Great. But he certainly cut a great Alexander-looking figure. He had a great fleet, a lot of money, a mercenary army, and a mature son named Antigonus, after the grandfather, Antigonus Gonatas. So what Demetrius did was put himself in charge of Macedon and the Greek world. If Demetrius had been satisfied with this, he could have probably died as king of Macedon. But Demetrius was restless. The word in Greek that Plutarch keeps using is pleonexia. He could never concentrate on a single project. And that goes back to some of the passages I had read earlier about him in a previous lecture, and that is, Demetrius had a great mind for logistics, for engineering, but he could never concentrate on the central point. This was seen in his generalship. He was always ready to charge with his cavalry against a fleeing opponent. And at the Battle of Ipsus, Lysimachus was more than willing to oblige, because the suspicion is the retreat of Lysimachus' cavalry was a feigned retreat to draw Demetrius off the battlefield. So as soon as he secured Macedon, he really took this idea of being Alexander the Great seriously and began building up an army, amassing mercenaries, and his idea was to recreate the exploits of Alexander the Great by invading Asia the way Alexander invaded the Persian Empire. But the political situation was not the same. And so what Demetrius did is he left his son Antigonus Gonatas in control of Macedon and raised the Macedonian army, hired mercenaries, got his fleet, and sailed to Asia Minor. He landed in the vicinity of Ephesus and proceeded to march inland. And this was probably in late 288. And in 287 BC, his army pushed into Asia Minor. It got hopelessly lost. It ran out of supplies. Lysimachus harried the forces of Demetrius in Asia, and Lysimachus' army essentially drove Antigonus II, the son of Demetrius, out of Macedon and essentially took over Macedon. The balance of Demetrius's army struggles across the plateau of Asia Minor, has a horrible winter, crosses the Taurus Mountains, famished and broke, and Seleucus is waiting for him and essentially hires on Demetrius's army and takes Demetrius as a permanent guest at the Seleucid court. After all, Demetrius's daughter is now married to Seleucus's son, and Demetrius is allowed to hang around at Antioch and eventually drinks himself to death. That is a rather pitiful figure, and Plutarch goes on at great length of pointing out how Demetrius really succumbed to drink, whereas Alexander really didn't, and that's part of the whole point of Plutarch's effort to exonerate Alexander for the death of Clytus. In any event, Demetrius is taken off the map. Lysimachus occupies Macedon, and those ports in Phoenicia, in Cyprus, which had been in Demetrius' hands, well, Ptolemy gets them as the door prize. So in the year 287 BC, the situation is rather clarified. Now we have three states. Lysimachus' state, which in some ways prefigures the Middle Byzantine Empire. We have the Seleucid state, and of course we have Ptolemy in Egypt, with a kingdom in Egypt proper, and then this outer ring of various possessions in the Levant, in Cyprus, and in the islands of the Aegean, which act as his access to the Aegean world. The situation, however, was proved unstable, and we have one more round to go through, and that is Lysimachus' kingdom never held together. Lysimachus was by say 287 BC, when Demetrius finally is removed from the board, he was advanced in years, and all reports indicate that he was becoming increasingly suspicious and was an irascible figure. He never was particularly friendly to his son and heir Agathocles. Agathocles turns out to be a son of one of the daughters of Antipater. That is, he has a noble lineage that the Macedonians would accept, and he was extremely popular with Macedonians and Greeks. He was the ideal candidate to succeed to this bizarre realm of Lysimachus that combined Thrace, Macedon, and Asia Minor, and also required someone charismatic and dynamic to run the Greek cities. And Agathocles apparently could fill the bill. From all reports, he was popular, he understood what his role was, the Greeks seemed to like him as a ruler who would rule more in the fashion of Philip II, at least paying outward homage to the autonomy and freedom of the Greek states. Now, Lysimachus, as part of the deal with his alliance with Ptolemy, because Ptolemy and Lysimachus both feared Seleucus, they feared that Seleucus might try to make himself master of the whole empire, they cemented a marriage alliance, probably around somewhere in 284 BC. At this point, Lysimachus was a widower, and he married one of the daughters of Ptolemy, and her name was Arsinoe II. And she was the daughter of Ptolemy's favorite mistress. It so happened that Agathocles also had a Ptolemaic marriage. He was married to another daughter of Ptolemy, a woman named Lysandra. She was the daughter of Ptolemy by his first marriage, by that wife who was a daughter of Antipater. So the relationships are very close. Lysimachus is married to a Ptolemaic princess, many years younger than he is. His son is married to a Ptolemaic princess. These two half-sisters do not play well together. Agathocles is obviously the heir. Lysandra sees her children by Agathocles as the new rulers of this kingdom. She's joined by her full brother, known as Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, and the brother and sister hate the half-sister, Arsinoe, who is married to Lysimachus. The family commotion in the household of Lysimachus had major dynastic and political repercussions in the next several years. From the start, Arsinoe did everything to poison the mind of her very suspicious elderly husband against his son, and of course against his son's wife, who happened to be the half-sister she hated. Back in Alexandria, Ptolemy had divorced his first wife and elevated his mistress as his principal queen, and so Arsinoe II felt, I'm going to be the real queen too at Lysimaca in Ephesus, just as mom is back in Alexandria. At the same time, the brother of Lysandra, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, attached himself to Agathocles. He was a rather dashing figure. Ptolemy Caranus, that is the Thunderbolt. He was looking for a kingdom. He, just as his full sister Lysandra, were essentially disinherited in the interests of Ptolemy's children by the second marriage. There was a Ptolemy II back in Alexandria who would rule in Egypt. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt had no prospects in Alexandria, so he backed his sister at the court of Lysimachus, hoping that he would get some portion of this kingdom once his brother-in-law Agathocles came to the throne. Well, the politics got extremely brutal and ugly. Lysimachus was prevailed upon by his young wife Arsinoe to arrest his son, put him in prison, and eventually order his execution. According to one count, Lysimachus was so enraged at his son Agathocles that he actually strangled him. The result was Lysandra and Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, in probably 282 BC, fled the court of Lysimachus and made their way to Seleucus. And they reported that the old guy, Lysimachus, he's gone off his rocker. He's murdered his own son. He's coming under the influence of that young Ptolemaic wife. And you have to understand that Seleucus has Ptolemy nightmares. There's Ptolemies all over the place, marrying everyone else, and he feels rather hemmed in by Ptolemies, and he also still resents the fact that Ptolemy controls Phoenicia and southern Syria. And it didn't take much convincing for Seleucus to pick up on Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and Lysandra to declare war on Lysimachus and invade Asia Minor. Lysimachus clashed with Ptolemy in Central Asia Minor at a battle called Corupedium. Its precise location is uncertain, and we have very schematic descriptions of the battle. But in the battle, Lysimachus went down fighting. One of the last friends of Alexander the Great, he died to the last a king, and the result was Seleucus now had Lysimachus's kingdom. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt went ahead to Macedon to tidy up affairs and to prepare for the reception of Seleucus. Seleucus marched his army to the Hellespont, crossed over with an army, including a lot of neat elephants that he'd gotten from Chandragupta, and he was met by Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, who hailed Seleucus as king, returning home to Macedon after many, many years of absence, and he hailed him with his right hand and with the left hand put a dagger in Seleucus. Seleucus was killed on the shores ignominiously by his ally, and Ptolemy the Thunderbolt took over the elephants and the army and now declared himself king of Macedon. So it sounds rather confusing at the moment, but you have to realize that the Macedonian rulers always played rough, and these armies could easily transfer their loyalties to a charismatic commander, which apparently Ptolemy the Thunderbolt at least appeared to be. Seleucus died on the shores of Europe. His son Antiochus was left in charge of the Seleucid Empire, but the main field army was in the hands of Ptolemy the Thunderbolt. Ptolemy marched back to Pella. He tried to capture Arsinoe. Arsinoe eventually eluded Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and made her way back to Egypt, returned to Alexandria, where she found her full brother, Ptolemy II, ruling, and eventually married him, and she too retired as a queen and was made a god along with her dear brother, Ptolemy II. Not too bad for Arsinoe too. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, at this point, fell heir to at least Macedon, Thrace, and the Greek regions. The Asian possessions of Lysimachus were occupied by Seleucid forces and became part of the Seleucid Empire. Now, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, unfortunately, while he was proclaimed king, and in early 280 BC, it looked like he would be the new master of Europe and the Greeks, had the misfortune of essentially ruling at the time where a group of Celts came pouring out of Central Europe. They'd been on the move for generations. These would be called Gauls by the Romans, Galatians by the Greeks. And by 280 BC, they are barreling down the rivers of the Balkans with Greece as their objective. This was totally unexpected, and it was a result of the complicated fightings and the collapse of Lysimachus's kingdom. Lysimachus had a series of alliances with the native peoples of the Balkans that had kept these Celts long in check. Those alliances disintegrated with Lysimachus's death. And Ptolemy the Thunderbolt apparently was too busy trying to do away with his half-sister and impose his authority over the Macedonians and Greeks to pay attention to the northern frontiers. And the result is the Gauls poured in. In early 279 BC, Ptolemy had no choice but to meet this Gallic invasion, reputedly put at 30 or 50,000 warriors. It represented a group of tribes acting as a coalition. Ptolemy was killed in the fighting. The Macedonian army was defeated. And the result was not only was the Macedonian army massacred, Ptolemy's the thunderbolt's head was cut off and turned into a drinking cup. This is what Gauls do. You know, you collect cups of ex-Macedonian kings if you can. And that's how Ptolemy the Thunderbolt ended. The Gauls then invaded the Greek world. They crossed over Thessaly. They crossed the pass of Thermopylae, the strategic pass. Once again, the Phocians failed to guard it, as they did in 480 BC. One would wonder why anyone would ever use Phocians to guard the western approaches of the passes around Thermopylae. They burst into central Greece. They attempted to sack Delphi, but they missed. They were driven off. And in the complicated fighting that occurred between 279 and 277 BC, Antigonus Gonatas, the son of Demetrius, who had been left in charge of Macedon on his own and had, a mercenary army. He controlled the fetters of Greece, that is, the Macedonian positions in Greece. He had never been expelled. He had a navy. He intercepted and destroyed one of the Gallic columns. He was hailed by the Macedonians as their king. And Antigonus Gonatas, in 277 BC, occupies Pella and establishes his family as the kings of Macedon. It would be his family, the family of Demetrius, not Lysimachus's family, who would rule over Macedon and control the Greek world down to the Roman conquest. And Antigonus was the king the Macedonians needed. He was not a flashy figure like Ptolemy the Thunderbolt or his own father Demetrius, with grandiose schemes of conquering a great empire. He cut the figure of Philip of Macedon, and by inclination he was a Stoic. One of my favorite phrases that Antigonus uses is that he saw the kingship of Macedonia as the golden slavery, he kouseia douleia, that it was an obligation he took on for the betterment of his people, of the Macedonians, and he proved an immensely popular and successful king who gave Macedon and Greece peace for over a generation and also rid the Greek world of these nasty Galatians. Now, the Galatians ended up moving east. They were eventually transported to Asia Minor by a local king of Bithynia, a fellow named Nicomedes. They were brought in as mercenaries, and they were a general nuisance until the Seleucid king Antiochus I eventually defeated them at the so-called Battle of the Elephants and drove them onto the plateau, where they settled down and became Galatians, mercenaries for hire, the Galatians who are referred to in the letter of St. Paul, and there they would remain as Celtic tribal nations down to the Roman conquest and beyond. So by 275 BC, the political order had been clarified. The Asian possessions were now in the hand of the Seleucid kings. The kingdom of Macedon, along with the control of the Greek city-states, was in the hands of the Antigonid kings, that is, the descendants of Antigonus I and Demetrius. It is a grandson of Antigonus I who rules. And the Ptolemaic kings now rule in Egypt. They control Egypt and the various areas in the eastern Mediterranean. The three kingdoms were now in place, the three great Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the Hellenistic world for the next two generations until the arrival of the Romans. There is one player that never quite made it in all this mess, and I would like to close with him because he's another Alexander imitator. And his name was Pyrrhus. I referred to him as the Red King of Epirus. He had flashy red hair. He ruled the kingdom of Epirus. He attempted to take Macedon on several occasions. He intervened in the complicated fighting between the two brothers of Cassander and never could quite make it in the Hellenistic world, and he was seen as a disruptive element by everyone. In 280 BC, he took himself out of the running in the breakup of Lysimachus's kingdom by going west. He answered an appeal from the Greeks of southern Italy, from Taras, Tarentum, and a number of Greek soldiers of fortune had done this, and took with him an army that was literally the carbon copy of the army of Alexander the Great. The only difference is he had a bunch of elephants provided by Antiochus, the Seleucid king. With this army, he crossed over to southern Italy to defend the Greek city-states against these obnoxious barbarians. And he fought two important battles, one at Heraclea, one at Asculum, and these barbarians turned out to be Roman legionaries. In 275, Pyrrhus, after fighting several battles and winning a so-called Pyrrhic victory, that is a victory in which he won, but it cost him so much in men and manpower. In 275, he won a Pyrrhic defeat. He was decisively defeated at the Battle of Beneventum by one of my favorite Roman consuls, Manius Curius Dentatus, the bucktooth, reputedly the ugliest man in Rome. And the result was Pyrrhus went back to Greece, defeated by these Romans, which is really a preview of what's to come. He got involved in the complicated wars to regain his kingdom in Epirus, to try to regain Macedon, and this imitator of Alexander ended his days ignominiously attempting to capture the city of Argos in 272 BC. And the city was betrayed to Pyrrhus by elements favorable to him. The gates were opened, or a gate was open, and Pyrrhus came in with a strike force, and a complicated battle developed in the streets, and Pyrrhus sent back for reinforcements. The subordinate commander, for some reason, thought that an elephant would be a delightful piece of reinforcement in a street fight. This elephant that had been acquired by Seleucus from Chandragupta had fought at Ipsus in 301, had probably been taken over by Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, and unfortunately it ended up in Pyrrhus's army in Italy and was now back in Greece. This elephant, which is quite aged at this point, comes lumbering along, goes through the gate, and gets stuck. The army of the Epirot army can't come in to relieve Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus is fighting a young man in the streets, and apparently this young man's grandmother sees that her grandson is endangered by this hulking guy with red hair, and she throws some roof tiles down that decks Pyrrhus out, and Pyrrhus dies ignominiously in a street fight in Argos. Even more ignominious than Demetrius drinking himself to death, or Ptolemy the Thunderbolt ending up as the tableware of the Galatians. All three of them had been Alexander imitators. All of them had grand aspirations. None of them really ended up with the kingdom. It was the sensible men, Antigonus, Gonatus, and Ptolemy, who knew that the world of regional kingdoms was the way to go.